Yeah, seminar go. All right, judges.
I missed it, sorry.
All right, we're gonna get a presentation on guidance from everyone's favorite tutu, bears.
The first piece of radically candid feedback I received was that no one knows who the hell you are. 3 years ago, I was working my second ever Grand Prix Atlantic City. I was incredibly excited for the event. I was going down in a car with a bunch of my friends from Yale. One of them was going to test for L1 that weekend. I was working 3 whole days. I was incredibly pumped to meet a ton of other judges, worked really hard, just kill it at this event. Friday was fantastic. I was on grinders. Tons of people said I did a really good job. Saturday, I was working on the main. I was incredibly excited. I got to interact with pro Magic players, give a ruling to some people that I had heard the names of on coverage, read their articles. It was really exciting. I made some screw-ups, but I talked with them with my fellow judges. I felt like I got really good feedback. On Sunday, that friend of mine who would come with me passed his exam, and I helped him with that. I was incredibly excited. I thought I was doing so well. I thought that I was just crushing it. A couple days later, I saw something on Facebook that really made me sit and listen. A friend of mine named Jeff Foster, who some of you may have heard of, posted this on Facebook. He said, if you like this status, I'll tell you something that I don't like about you. I thought that was really interesting. I was thinking, I really respect Jeff. I'm not even sure if he thinks of me at all. I'd love to hear what he thinks I should be doing better. So I pressed the like button. Shortly thereafter, I get a post on my wall from Jeff that says, when I was talking about you with other judges at Atlantic City, none of them knew who the hell you were. I was incredibly floored by this comment. Fortunately, Jeff gave me advice on what I could be doing better, which was talking to other judges. But something had really changed within me. And although I didn't know it at the time, that was my first introduction to radical candor. Radical candor is simply a way of understanding what makes good feedback. And I say feedback, what I'm really talking about is guidance. When we say feedback, we think of judge-centered reviews, we think of performance evaluations of work. Feedback can feel screechy and alien to our ears, but it is something we want. More than that, I think what we really want is guidance. We want to know what we're doing well, and we want to know what we're doing poorly. In other words, we want to be receiving praise as well as criticism. That's all that guidance is. But how can we make guidance really great? Before I answer that question, I want each of you to close your eyes. I want you to think about the last time you received feedback from somebody in person, whether at work or in the judge program. I want you to think of that memory. I want you to put yourself in that chair. I want you to hear what that person told you. And I want you to remember how it made you feel. Hold on to that feeling. Open your eyes. And I'm going to show you a clip from Kim Scott about a piece of feedback she had that truly changed her life.
And finally she said, but, and I sort of held my breath, you said a lot. And I was like, no big deal, I know I do that. It didn't really seem like, who cared if I said a lot when I had a tiger by the tail? So she said, was it because you were nervous? Nervous, not me. And then she said, would it help if Google hired a speaking coach for you so that you could learn not to do this? And I said, I'm really busy. It just doesn't seem like the most important thing in the world. And she said, Kim, when you do that thing with your hand, I can tell I'm not really getting through to you. I'm going to have to be more clear here. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid.
This is Kim Scott. Kim Scott is a director at Google, and she was talking about an interaction she had with her boss at the time, Sheryl Sandberg, who's now the Facebook of CTO. So some pretty big names here. As you can see, Sheryl had to say something really direct to Kim in order to get her to listen. That was what, much like Jeff talked to me, really got Kim thinking, geez, why hasn't anyone ever told me this before? And more importantly, how can I take this leadership that Sheryl exemplified, and help other people do it in their own life? And fortunately, you don't have to be at Google or Facebook or in Silicon Valley to do it. You don't have to have a crazy big search engine. No, it's much, much, much simpler than all of that. And Kim came up with 2 things that you need to do in order to give really good feedback. The first of them is that you have to be willing to challenge people directly. She also calls this being willing to piss people off, and that's incredibly accurate. Much like Jeff's comments to me and Cheryl's comment to Kim, challenging someone directly might not be very nice. It's telling them something they probably don't want to hear, something that might be deeply uncomfortable for them, something that's going to require them to change and really adapt. And that's what the best guidance is, but it's very scary. And the way that we can actually counteract that is by making sure we give this feedback, these challenges, when we care personally about somebody else. So that's the second axis. Caring personally is what enables us, when we receive feedback, to not just go knee-jerk defensive on the other person, and actually begin to let that feedback sink in, and really let it change our behavior. So the intersection of those two is where radical candor lies. This might be something that's very familiar to some of you. It may be something that you've encountered in the past, even though you didn't have a word for it. Or it might be something that you're lacking in your life. Either of those is fine. The point of this talk is to give some words, put some language around here, so you can start to evaluate the feedback that you've been receiving and the feedback you've been giving. Because it is true that radical candor is very hard. And we're not always going to be able to actually achieve radical candor. But we should be trying. And if we're trying, but not actually achieving it, we have words for those too. This is a 2x2 grid. If you're challenging someone directly, but you don't actually convince them that you care personally about them, that's obnoxious aggression. No one likes to be second best, and obnoxious aggression is second best. But I also strongly believe that it is better than saying nothing at all. It is better to give that feedback, even if they get defensive about it, and maybe start to plant the seeds, than to say nothing. However, far too often, we actually do say nothing. We care so much about the other person that we don't want to hurt their feelings, or we just don't want to have the conversation with them right now. And that is ruinous empathy. Ruinous empathy, as a manager, as a friend, as a judge, is one of the worst things you can be doing to a friend of yours, or to anybody. We are responsible for the growth, not just of ourselves, but for other people around us. Ruinous empathy is a false kindness. It's the kind of person that says, why didn't anyone ever tell me this before? How could you let me go for so long without telling me that I'm not actually good at deck checks, that I actually don't talk loudly enough at the table? Why didn't anyone ever tell me this before? As much as possible, we want to avoid people saying those words. We want to avoid the ruinous empathy. The last part on this graph is something called manipulative insincerity. I don't think manipulative insincerity is worth talking about that much. It's basically when you're being a total jerk. Kim Scott, who invented radical candor as a concept, says that even in her life, and she has a much more storied career than I do, she's encountered only really 2 people that exhibit manipulative insincerity. So I don't think it's worth spending too much time to talk about this. But basically, if you don't care about someone and you're not shouting them directly, that's just being manipulative. You're just going back to high school and playing games with people. The caution is that you really want to challenge people directly. Manipulative insincerity most often happens when someone is obnoxiously aggressive and they're told to be less aggressive, so they actually just become very passive aggressive instead. So if that might describe you, this might be something to be a little concerned of. Now, the reason I have this grid up here is because of the interaction from before. I want you to think about the interaction you had and place it somewhere on that grid. How challenging was that feedback, and how much did that person make you care about it? How many of you feel that the feedback falls into manipulative insincerity? No one. Excellent. How many of you feel that it falls into obnoxious aggression? 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4 people. What about ruinous empathy? Couple big hands. How many of you feel that you actually received radical candor? Okay. About like 15 people. That is fantastic. That is great. That makes me think that something is going right in the judge program. Something is going right in your own lives. I'm very happy to hear that. The next part of this talk is going to talk about, besides challenge directly and caring personally, how can we really give good guidance? So again, I'd like you to think about this for a little bit. Try and come up with a couple of words about what really makes good guidance. What is something you want every piece of feedback you receive to contain? Once you've got that, if you're interested in sharing, just put up your hand, and I'd like you to say both your name and also just one word that you think exemplifies having good guidance.
Amanda, and I guess empathy.
So Amanda says that to be good, we have to have empathy.
Elon?
How? Elon says that good guidance is how.
Elliot, clarity.
Elliot says clarity.
Thaddeus, sincere.
Thaddeus says sincere.
Will? Useful.
When Will says useful. All right. So that's what we have for now. I've done some thinking of this as well and listened to Kim Scott's talk, and I've come up with a couple of adjectives that I think can really help us push through radical candor. First of them, conveniently enough, is being helpful and humble. The main thing to keep in mind about radical candor is that it's not about you. It's about the person you're talking to. You shouldn't be arrogant. You shouldn't be trying to just prove a bigger point, because otherwise you're not being radically candid at all. You're making it about you instead of about how they can improve. So you need to be helpful. You need to be humble. The second is that you need to be immediate and direct. And this is something where I think the judge program has a fantastic leg up on the rest of the world, because we have shadowing. At my very first big event, I was fortunate enough to be shadowed on my first call by Allie Medwin, a judge who then went off to go work for Wizards of the Coast, some company you may have heard of. I took a call where I didn't do a great job. I sort of bungled my interaction with players and explaining the rules of interactions to them. Afterwards, Allie took me aside and said, hey, let's talk about that. I think you could have done this better. And she pointed out specifically things I could do, and she did it right after the ruling. I think it's incredibly important to always be doing this after the interaction. There's advice out there that says, as a CEO, you should have an opinion on everything. In the judge program, we aren't necessarily CEOs, but I think this advice is incredibly important. If we offer advice on everything, people will accept that feedback always at face value. One thing that was really interesting at the very beginning of Kim Scott's clip is that she talked about how, in the beginning of her conversation with Cheryl, she was kind of waiting for that other shoe to drop, for the but to come. She could tell that Cheryl was basically kind of puffing her up and giving her some praise before saying what she really wanted to say. Does that evoke anything to anyone? Got a couple of nods, a couple of big hands, yeah. That is often called the compliment sandwich. I think it should be called the shit sandwich. You have the real criticism in the middle, which is the thing you're really trying to say, and maybe you have the best of intentions. You are truly being humble and helpful, but you're wrapping it in this phrase to try and make it more gentle. Radical candor says, don't do that. Say what you mean, and one of the benefits is that if you give someone praise, they aren't going to look behind the curtain and wonder, when is the shoe going to drop? When is the butt going to come? They're going to accept that feedback at face value. I think that's truly kind, and I hope you do too. The third quality refers to the old adage, praise in public and criticize in private. This is something that, again, has been in the judge program a lot. I want to break it down a little bit and explain part of why it's so important. When I was doing that interaction with Allie, she was giving me feedback on how I had done that ruling. It's very important that she didn't correct me in front of the players. The ruling went fine, just imperfectly. She didn't jump in and correct me. She didn't make me lose credit or lose face in front of these players. She waited until it was done, and then, in private, between the two of us, she told me what she really felt. Because of that, I was able to be put in place with more security and less defensiveness. I was able to accept her feedback instead of worrying about how am I going to be perceived, how will other people think about me. The flip side of that is when someone does something really well, we should celebrate that. We should put it into the public sphere. This is going to relate to your point later, where we're going to talk about you get the behaviors that you reward, and the way you actually know what is truly good is by talking about it. You should shine a light on the great things that the community is doing. Another important element of good guidance is that it should be observable. There's a quote in the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. If you call someone foolish, you've called them a name, but you haven't changed anything. If you just apply a label to someone, that is the opposite of progress. It's very important that Cheryl didn't call Kim stupid. She said, you sound stupid when you say so much. She wasn't ascribing the stupidity to Kim herself, she was talking about the action. In much the same way, when we're giving feedback as judges, we should focus on specific observable actions that our subjects did, as opposed to rendering value judgments on the other person. This also relates to the fundamental attribution error. This is a cognitive bias. How many people have heard of the fundamental attribution error before? Maybe about half the room. What the fundamental attribution error says is that when I do something wrong, it's because of my circumstances. But when you do something wrong, it's because you're a bad person. You see someone speeding and they cut you off. You think to yourself, what a jerk. When I cut someone off, it's because my wife is in the car seat and she's pregnant or whatever. That's fundamental attribution error. And this is the same thing here. By focusing on actions instead of on people, we can try and avoid that. The last part of this talk is actually about how we can take the radical out of radical candor. I'm not sure how needed this is, given that half of you in the room said your last interaction was radically candid, which is really exciting to me, and also, to be perfectly honest, quite unexpected. That being said, I still want to talk about it because I do think that a lot of people, even if they have some specific interactions that are radically candid, as a program, we can be doing a lot more to address the things that aren't going well. The one way you can achieve radical candor is by talking about it constantly. Kim Scott goes so far as to saying you should print out the quadrant, the two axes, put it by your desk, which might not apply here, bring it to your next event, and actually have people give you a sticker, put it on the quadrant and say, this is where I felt our last interaction was. That's the way that you can be getting feedback about your own behavior and really assessing if you're being radically candid or not. Communication is incredibly important. There's a mindset, there's an adage that if you're trying to bring a company up to here in some quality, you really have to go all the way up to there in order to make it swing that much. You have to swing the meter far harder than you think you have to get to move just a little. And I think that radical candor is like that as well. So, communicate constantly. The second part of turning radical candor into everyday candor is to ask for guidance. This is related to what I said before about asking other people how you're doing and constantly asking for evaluation. Nothing is alone, and feedback is just as important feedback is just about the subject as it is about you. That's where the guidance comes in. I mentioned a little about the ruinous empathy quadrant. That's a quadrant I wanted to revisit. In Papua New Guinea, there's a wonderful world called a makita. A makita is a truth that everyone knows, but no one discusses. And in Papua New Guinea, the people there assess the health of a community by how many makitas it has. If you have many makitas, your community is unhealthy. There's something rotten inside it. If your community is open, if you have very few makitas, it's much healthier. There's a story in the corporate world about a company that instituted casual Fridays. And most people assume that that meant they can wear jeans and sneakers and maybe a nice shirt or something. And there is one person in accounting who felt that casual Friday meant that he could wear pajamas and fluffy bunny slippers. And everyone felt that this was unacceptable. But not a single person actually went and talked about it. And then, 3 months later, the executives at the company canceled Casual Friday with no explanation. But everybody knew, and people in human resources confirmed, it was because of that one guy who wore pajamas to work. I want that to sink in a little bit. A company changed an entire policy instead of having one conversation. That is the danger of makitas. I referred to earlier the whole idea of ruinous empathy. Why didn't anyone tell me? So often, we know what that person isn't doing right, but they don't. They don't have the ability to step outside themselves and see them as we see them, and we haven't actually gone up to them and told them, this is what you need to work on. That is incredibly unfair. It's incredibly unfortunate, and it's a gigantic barrier to growth. So makitas are something we have to be very wary of, and as much as possible, just correct. And again, I believe this is where being immediate about our feedback can come in. If we see something wrong, say something, and correct it, we don't have to get all worked up about, is this a good time? Is this a bad time? How will they feel about me telling this feedback? No, we just tell them in the moment, and they take it and they move on, and we go from there. Another important part of radical candor is building a great team. If you have a unity of purpose, a unity of mission, and a shared passion, it's so much easier to care personally about one another. This is something where I think that the team-based nature of judging and judging events really enables radical candor to shine. It may not be that we see each other every day, but we do some pretty incredible things on the floor of a Grand Prix, and the teams that come together really feel like coherent units for the course of that day. When you have a great team, that sense of shared purpose is quite palpable. Whenever we're a team leader, even when we're a team member, I think we should be mindful of that, trying to really make these connections with other people, because it makes it that much easier to give them guidance, to give them radically candid feedback later on. I promised I would talk about this earlier. The next idea is that you get the behaviors you reward. I think this is incredibly important with all the discussion about the exemplar program. When we shine a spotlight on something, we're more likely to see that again. In the same way, if we are an example of radical candor to other people, that will help them see what we're doing and inspire them to do themselves. You get the behaviors that you reward. if you see someone honestly, directly, but nonetheless respectfully giving feedback to a different person, you are much more likely to do that on your own in the future. The last big idea is that good intention is not enough. Good intentions need to be accompanied by powerful actions. Something that I've been thinking about a lot and that I really believe to be true is that good leaders are vulnerable. And not just in the I'm going to overshare with you sense, but in the setting an example sense. Giving some sort of example from their history that enables them to be more relatable. And this isn't just about forming charisma, about being charismatic or forming connections. If I'm the head judge of an event and I say to my staff, hey, I'm really working on how I take appeals at this event. It's something that I haven't done so well in the past. I really want to do well in this event. So please tell me if you think my appeals are doing well or if you think they're doing poorly. If you ask for that kind of feedback, even though you've only asked about one thing, you've actually pre-authorized people to come to you to talk about anything. It sets the tone for the entire event. And in the same way, you can do this as a team lead and as a team member. If you say, hey, I'm really looking for feedback on my rules knowledge. I'm really looking for some help with how I address players. I really want to get better at respectful language. Even if someone doesn't see you having a problem with your pronouns or with your rules knowledge, because you asked for that feedback at the beginning of the day, they're going to be much more likely to come with you about anything. And that's one way that we can make radical candor into everyday candor. To emphasize those again, communicate constantly and ask for guidance. These are very much related. If you communicate what radical candor is, in order to ask someone, was I radically candid, you probably have to tell them what radical candor is. This is great because it also spreads this idea of radical candor as something people can be doing to deliver truly great feedback. Self-evaluation is incredibly important, and so is evaluation from other people, so I don't think those two things are very easy to judge with. The middle one, building a great team. Again, nothing totally outlandish, but I think it's really powerful when you realize that great teams are much more likely to give great feedback. Team building isn't an end in and of itself. It's important because of what it can accomplish. And one of those things is radical candor. The fourth idea, you give the behaviors you reward. If you are being radically candid and other people are thanking you for it, that will inspire others to also be radically candid. And finally, powerful actions. Being vulnerable, being honest, setting an example for other people. Those are powerful actions that are actually going to make people sit up and listen, much like Kim did, much like Jeff did to me, and really be driven to change. To close, I want to share a story from a little while ago when I was out in California. I was with a friend who was not a magic judge, and I was talking to him about radical candor, because the two of us often talk about big ideas and share what we're thinking about. And he said to me, wow, that's really interesting. And I've heard about it before. So, are you practicing radical candor? And that actually really took me aback. Even though I had written a blog post about it, even though I had already agreed to sign up for this seminar slot, I'd never just been asked, are you practicing radical candor? I realized I hadn't truly made the commitment to myself to be radically candid. So I had to pause before I replied to him. And then I said, yes. Yes, I am practicing radical candor. And I think it's important to use that word practice. It is a process. None of us are perfect. I'm not perfect. I certainly failed and been ruinously empathetic instead of radically candid in instances in the past, even as recently as my last event. That's okay. Learning is a process, and as long as we're committed to stepping down that road, we're still getting to a much better place than we were before. I'd like you all to invite me in the same way to practice radical candor. To do that, I want to ask two things. The first is, after this presentation, after this conference. Go to one of your mentors or go to one of the people who you've worked with recently. And first, explain to them what radical candor is. Explain the two axes, explain what it is, why it makes good guidance. And then, ask them for a piece of radically candid feedback. Think about that, thank them for it, and think about how it made you feel. And then, I'm going to set up a forum thread in the event on Judge Apps, and I'd like you to post in that thread what your reaction was. Are you willing to do that? Awesome. Thank you for listening. At this point, I'd like to use the rest of the time to take questions. Jeremy.
So where does the radical part come in radical candor?
Sure.
Get a better idea of why it's called that?
Sure. Jeremy's question is, where does the word radical come in for radical candor? It comes in because it's something that is not often done. Kim Scott describes it as the secret to success in business. I don't necessarily have statistics on whether people are being brutally empathetic, but it's something that Kim noticed in her own practice, and I can think of tons of examples where I've just sort of let people slide because I didn't want to hurt their feelings, I didn't know how to say or sum up the radically candid feedback that I actually had for them.
And when you say success on that, what are you finding as success? Like getting the results that you're looking for, basically?
Yeah, and the follow-up is, have you seen success? A lot of people have come to me after I wrote the blog post about this and said that this was really, really powerful and very much motivated to them. They've realized that they've had successful moments of feedback that were radically candid, even though they didn't have the words for it back then. And this is not just a US thing, this was even true in Europe. So I would say that it's a success. But really, I think the word radical isn't just about who's doing it, who's not doing it. It's about the fact that it's a very powerful and challenging thing to do. If you say that something is radical, I think that can be a good way to remind yourself, yes, this is hard, but I'm still striving to make it a success. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I mean, there's more than you said. I think
Yeah.
it's good to start.
Are there more questions?
Have you ever had a time where you've, ever since you've been practicing, that you've had to, reevaluate the type of feedback you give to someone based on a perceived notion of how they would take that feedback you give?
Sure. So Tom's question is, since you started practicing radical candor, have you ever had to reevaluate how you give feedback based on how you react? Sure. I think that's a very good question. And the interesting thing about radical candor is that it actually says that the reaction of the other person isn't as important as you might think it is. So again, Brutus empathy comes about from being reluctant to make people defensive, being reluctant to make people uncomfortable, being reluctant to say these maquitas aloud. Brutus empathy says that if you truly care personally about somebody, you need to give them that feedback, even though it might be hard, even though they might react poorly. When I've given radical candor to a few people, in the moment, they've been very surprised and taken aback, but as they've processed it, they've realized just how important it was. And I think that's going to be a fairly typical result. Another big thing is that feedback is a gift. Again, when you give feedback, it's not about you, it's about the recipient. We do have a bit of an obligation as receivers of feedback to treat this feedback as a gift, as something that someone is taking time out of their day to give to us so we can improve. It is totally natural to be defensive to feedback. We're scared of growth. Not that we're scared of growth, but we're scared of change because change is what's led us to here, and we're successful here where we are. But if we embrace more of a growth mindset, we can become less defensive when giving feedback.
All right, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions with regards to the y-axis more than the x-axis.
Sure.
So I'd say I thought the talk was certainly very interesting and giving me a lot to think about. But I think that something that has sort of been a little bit come over is just how you define where somebody is on this cares personally axis.
Yeah.
So some of what this slide, I don't know that much about the background of the field, I don't think the you have obviously, is that this type of guidance and feedback has value. You can process it because you're getting it from somebody who you have a relationship with.
Right.
Like if I were to give you the exact same words and you not, I'm somewhere lower on that axis, it falls into a different question, even though the feedback and the suggested guidance, those words could be exactly the same, right?
Yep.
And so that's where I think that while this certainly has applications where you feel that you might be in that upper right quadrant with a particular person, that's not always going to be the case, right? And in fact, in the judge program in general, I'm going to argue that in most circumstances, in fact, it is not necessarily going to be, in my point of view, as to what being in that upper right axis means in terms of caring personally.
Sure.
I might say that there are a few judges who I have had long experience with who I would fall into that quadrant. There are a lot of people who can tell me the exact same feedback, I've done the exact same stupid thing, and they want to give me that feedback where I would not be in that, and it would sort of fall into this other quadrant. So how do you maybe deal with that situation, or maybe I'm overreading into what the philosophy is with regards to just exactly the extent of this cares personally, how it has to be a mutual sort of appreciation that both parties feel.
Yeah. Okay. So Eric basically wanted to ask about the vertical axis, which is the cares person axis, and he advanced the idea that it can be very challenging to build that in the judge program, just by the nature of the judge program, and it's very difficult to know where you really stand with someone on that axis. So how can you reconcile that with this idea of gratification? So, first of all, if you don't care personally about somebody, but you give them powerful, important feedback, that's obnoxious aggression. And that is, in my opinion, still so much better than saying nothing at all. You have to be willing to be a bit of an asshole to give this feedback. I'm not saying be a jerk about it, but realize that it might make them be uncomfortable. And it's still important to get that out there. The second part of the question is, how do we know if we care personally or not? I don't have a magical solution to this. This is something where the judge program, I think, suffers compared to a work environment where you're literally sitting next to people for 40 hours or more a day. In the judge program, as I mentioned, alluded to earlier, you're kind of building these ephemeral bonds during a single event, and they might dissipate a little bit as you go on. So how can we capitalize on that? And there's a couple different ways. For me, things like this are part of caring personally. We're getting to know each other better. We're getting to see people that are taking time out of their weekend to share their knowledge, to advance cool ideas, to talk about the rules, to explain diversity, and that's great. As a community, the judge program has a lot of sort of, let's call it preferred caring personally, because we're part of this environment together. As far as one-on-one interactions, I think that it's really up to your personal style. I can envision someone saying, look, this might be hard for you to hear, and I know we don't know each other very well yet, but I think that you really deserve to hear this. You're not saying, I really think you're going to be a great judge, because that would be sort of false, that would be a false hope, but I think you deserve to hear this is a way of sort of bootstrapping that caring person. So again, there are ways to do it depending on your own personal style, the particular context you have with that person. At the end of the day, if you don't care, if they don't believe you care personally as much about you as you do about them, that's fine, as long as you give them that guidance and that feedback. I saw a hand in the back. Yes.
You mostly talking about using radical candor for discussing with among peers.
Yes.
Do you ever use radical candor when dealing with players?
With players?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question was, I've talked about using radical candor amongst the judge community. What about using radical candor with players? And yes, I actually do believe that this can be helpful for players as well, especially in matters of unsporting conduct. There is a certain player who I was basically radically candid with, even though I wasn't using those words, those thoughts at the time, about a year ago, because they interrupted me during announcements and literally heckled me. And I actually took that player aside during one of the rulings and said, hey, look, I've seen you around, I know you've seen me around, we've been at a ton of events together, you know that I've been around the block a couple times. It's like, yeah, I know. Like, all right, well, so when I tell you that your actions were some of the most disrespectful I've ever seen as a judge, that really means something. And that was something that was very hard to say. I do believe it was radically candid. And I believe it made, I'm not sure if it made a lasting impression or not, but I do believe it made much more impression than just kind of the generic finger wag, this wasn't correct. I will also add on, even though there was in fact an entire seminar on de-escalating players in this very room, when interacting with players, we do have the tool of assessing a penalty, which is another way of kind of getting them to listen and indicate that they did something incorrect. But I think that radically candor is a powerful tool for players as well.
You really understand there are those situations where it's not quite covered by the rules, where maybe it's not quite reporting, but it is important piece.
What's your name?
Nate.
Jacob.
Jacob.
Jacob. For those who couldn't hear it, Jacob at the end elaborated the idea that radical candor with players can be helpful in situations where policy doesn't necessarily apply and we couldn't give out a penalty, but we can give out radical candor. I certainly think that being forced to listen to me is a punishment, so. Are there more questions? Yes.
Do you think there's times when it's better to go through an intermediary rather than directly giving such feedback?
All right.
Say I have a coworker and maybe we don't have the best one-on-one relationship, but there's a message you want to relate. Maybe you want to tell your boss or something, or a head judge if it's a judging.
Yeah. So Jerry's question is, are there times where it might be better to relay radically candid feedback through an intermediary? So if you listen to Kim Scott's talk, which I would strongly recommend, she actually discusses this in some detail. And one of her points of view is that you should make it impossible to backstab somebody, and that you shouldn't play what she calls shuttle diplomacy. Shuttle diplomacy is where I talk to Tom about how much I hate Alex, and I ask Tom to tell Alex my feedback. That's this idea of shuttle diplomacy. And that can be very dangerous for organizations, because instead of really just solving the problem, you're trying to go through somebody to do it. That's the antithesis of being radically candid. So instead, we should set this expectation in our lives, in our organizations, in the events we help run, that if I have a problem with how somebody is doing something, I should reach out to them directly, instead of going through the head judge or going through some other party. If and only if that fails, is going through an intermediary a supported operation. Does that answer your question?
Kind of. I mean, at some point you want to make sure you're not overstepping the bounds of the head judge, right?
Sure.
So maybe you at least want to notify them. You maybe say to the head judge,
Okay.
I'm going to talk to this person. I
Sure.
want to see where you strike that balance.
Sure, so Jeremy wants to know about how do you strike a balance between making sure you don't overstep your bounds. This is challenging for judging because we are an organization that isn't necessarily non-hierarchical, but the hierarchy is constantly shifting and can't necessarily be looked up. I might be at an event where I'm the head judge of person B one day, and then the next day I'm reporting to them as a team lead, or even I'm reporting 2 levels to them because I'm on somebody else's team. So this constantly shifting hierarchy can make it very challenging. I believe that caring personally is a helpful solution here, because it's more about the personal relationships and about I am the boss, so I'm giving you feedback, or we are peers and we're the same level, so I'm not going to listen to you because what do you mean? We certified the same day. Of course I'm doing things right. Those are not super helpful behaviors. And as much as possible, whenever we give feedback, we shouldn't fret over who gave it, but rather what did it say and what is the content of it. So it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but to go to your core question, which is how do we know if we're not overstepping our bounds? And this is where I think asking for feedback comes up. And you can do that with the person you're talking to. You can say, hey, you seemed a little uncomfortable when I was talking to you. Was I overstepping my bounds at all? And maybe they say, yeah, actually, it did make me feel somewhat uncomfortable. You're like, oh, okay, I'm sorry, that wasn't my intention. Or they say, no, you're totally fine. And if you think that's sincere, great. If you don't think it's sincere, maybe anonymously you can talk to somebody else and say, hey, I gave person X feedback about this time they did thing A. Was I out of bounds about that? I think if you depersonalize it and make it about, I'm looking for feedback on how my feedback giving was, instead of, I'm going to tell you about this bad thing the person needed, you're more likely to be in the right mindset. So thank you for the very helpful question. Yes?
To jump on his question, how do you feel about like how does direct anonymous feedback factor into all this?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
How does like direct anonymous feedback factor?
Direct anonymous feedback? So the question was, how does anonymous feedback play into the idea of radical candor?
Yeah, not necessarily like shuttling it, but just like.
So anonymous feedback can't be radically candid because there is no existence on the caring personally axis. You don't know where it's from. And that makes it very challenging. As someone who actually has had to sort of filter feedback from various sources or through the Magic Judge feedback form, it's very challenging because I didn't see this thing directly. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's accurate. So that's its whole other challenge. And I think what fundamentally ends up happening is that even though I'm maybe taking feedback from other sources, anonymous sources, I need to own that feedback. I need to say, look, where this feedback comes from doesn't matter. It comes from me as far as it really matters, and take it from me, not from some non-description. That's the way to add back in the radically candid nature of the feedback and put in the caring personally access. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. I think we have time for just one more question.
So where you do lack a rapport with someone and you're maybe kind of hurting on that care personally axis,
Yeah.
what do you think of the idea of relating that criticism back to things you commonly care for and respect, such as the community and the game?
So the question was, when you lack the caring personally access with somebody, how do I feel about relating that feedback to the access of the community in the game?
As a sort of substitute for a personal rapport.
As a substitute for personal rapport. I think that can be very helpful. If you find out what makes someone tick, that is a great way of knowing what they'll be receptive to. It's not necessarily the same thing as I care personally about your advancement or your mentorship, but it is, you care enough to try and figure out how can I make this feedback the most receptive. So if you know that Chris cares a lot about his community and he's taking advantage and he's doing things that are damaging his community, maybe I don't know Chris very well, but if I go to him and say, hey, you're doing something that's really damaging to your community, that's going to make him listen. So I think that's a really great idea. And you can use these shared values, like I alluded to earlier, as a proxy for caring personally. Thank you all so much for listening. It was great to talk to you.
It is 3:48. The next presentation will be at 4.